So now I'm ready to start adding my details. All those things are going to make this look realistic and complete my sculpt. So remember, this is hollowed. My tube is in place. I have put my piece back together, and now I can focus in things like feathers and eyes and the shape of the beak. So you want to think about proportion throughout the whole entire sculpture. I need to make sure my eyes are the correct size for my bird. So I'm actually rolling out a little ball of clay and then cutting it in half and shaping it to look like the eye on my sculpture. So then I can play around with cutting those a little thinner. I can kind of pinch and shape them and place them by looking at it from a head-on view and both side views, because I want the eyes to line up. I don't want them to stick too far out from the head. I want the placement to be in the correct spot. And so I haven't scored and slipped these, but I'm just kind of lightly marking, checking, and then I can score and slip them onto the piece. So you want to build out your features. You don't want to just quickly carve in an eyeball. You want to actually look at the shape of it. You want to build it out. I'm going to be adding little eyelids that go over the eyes. So even though they might look a little weird right now because they're sticking out so far, I am going to kind of blend that out and fill that in a little bit. So now if I pinch out a tiny bit of clay, kind of study the shape of that lid that comes over the eye. So I'm always working with my photos nearby so I can compare what I'm doing. I can bend and manipulate and like slightly blend that lid onto the form. The lid is so small that I'm not scoring and slipping it. I'm just kind of doing a blend, kind of like you would a blended seam on a slab project. And putting in some detail work, kind of carving that back out. And then I can add one to the other side, and I often will go back and forth between the two to make sure my details are even and consistent. I don't want to get a whole bunch of work done to one side and then not be able to match it on the other. So now I'm going to work on that little lower lid that kind of goes underneath the eyeball. And this is generally how I work. I'll kind of just work from one feature to the next. Remember, the smaller your details, the quicker they're going to want to dry, so you're going to have to really keep an eye on that. Gently pressing that into place and then shaping the lids with my pin tool. Now I'm looking at the beak. I'm measuring the length of it compared to the length, like the width of the head. Beaks are tapered, so they're thicker where they attach to the head and then taper out to a point. So I'm kind of shaping this into that, what I'm seeing, pulling that into a sharp point, and then kind of measuring how long that actually needs to be, cutting off the extra. Can play around with placement and angle. Mark where I want to actually attach it and score and slip. I am rolling a super tiny coil to wrap around this beak attachment and kind of blend it in. If you look at real birds, their beaks kind of get wider and spread as it reaches the face. And so I can replicate that by kind of adding and building out some clay. So it doesn't just look like I took a carrot shape and stuck it on the end of his face. I want it to have that seamless transition and look a little bit more realistic, what a real robin has. I have to be careful because this is a very delicate part of my sculpture, and so if I add this piece and then I have to wrap it in plastic because I don't finish, I want to keep the plastic very loose around it. So I'm continuing to build that out. You can see in my sketch I've kind of circled how wide it should be, and you can see in the actual sculpture that it's still pretty narrow at that attachment point. So I'm building that up, blending it back and forth to give the beak a more natural transition into the head of the bird. And I'm working from an aerial view so I can make sure it's even on both sides. So now I'm going to focus on wings. And I think the easiest way to replicate a wing is to roll out a thin slab and maybe layer thin slabs and lightly draw that wing shape on, keeping in mind that it's the correct width, size, shape, proportion for the actual body of my sculpture. You can pay attention to like those little marks and asymmetrical lines in the feathers. Looking at placement. I can go ahead and trace this one now that I have a shape that I feel is correct. So I have two of them and I can attach one on each side. So part of the requirement for this assignment is detail, textures, those small things that really push your sculpting to the next level. Mark my placement, make sure it's correctly placed on the body. I can start to score and slip. My score marks are very close together and very tight. You don't want to leave any gaps because you could potentially trap air between the wing and the body or any other slab attachment in your form, and you could end up with something that kind of blows back off in the kiln. So really close score marks. I'm using a serrated edge of a rib tool, and then I'll come back in with my pin tool and kind of touch up the little areas that I missed. You don't want your score marks few and far between because then you're trapping air. So I'm working immediately to soften those edges. I don't want this to just look like a slab that I cut out of clay. I want to start to refine it, smoothen it, shape it, bend it out a little so it looks more natural. Make sure my attachment points are blended behind. And then I've decided I'm going to come in with a couple extra smaller slab wing feather kind of shapes and layer them to give my wings a little bit more depth and dimension. So I'm going to take this smaller shape, kind of score and slip it, kind of build that out a little further. Okay, so now I have some layer and some dimension built up on those wings. And I'm going to roll out another thin slab. And I'm focusing on that long kind of tail shape where the longer kind of wings or feathers kind of come together. I want that extension coming off the back of the form. I tend to make my shapes too big because it's a lot easier to cut them down than it is to start over when they're too small. So you've probably noticed that throughout this sculpt. Like when I made the beak too big and I initially had the body too big. So I kind of like to whittle that down and refine it or cut off the excess. So by supporting the underside of this, I can apply pretty good pressure to the top and really smooth that out, bend it, shape it, figure out exactly what I want that to look like. Measure it, make sure it's the right length compared to my picture. And I'm cutting some of the excess off because I want it to be more pointed, just like a real bird would look like, or a real robin in this case. So at this point, I'm going to get into kind of layering feathers and looking at those long kind of tail feathers and cutting these pointed shapes. I'm just looking for placement right now. I'm not scoring and slipping yet because I want to make sure it looks right. Sometimes you have to experiment a little bit with different applications, but I like to have textures that actually rise up off of the form as well as are carved in. I think it gives it more depth, more dimension. And so by having feathers that are different lengths, different types of curves, not each one is totally the same, it makes the piece feel a little bit more natural. And I can start to create some dimension because birds have so many cool textures. I want to have that in my sculpture. Once I like the placement, I can score and slip those and get those attached to the bird. I generally won't score and slip the entire form. Sometimes I like the little tips or edges to lift off, so I don't want the whole entire thing attached. So you have to think about things like that as you design your piece. And although I'll do a little bit of smoothing as I go, I tend to come back and refine that after the piece has kind of been finished or closer to finished. So although the detail work can be a little bit tedious, you can see how much it can transform a piece. So there's some depth, there's some dimension. Sometimes I'll go back in and add another one or two if I feel like it's not balanced or there's some empty space that I don't like. I am going to add carving detail to this as well. I don't want to load up the bird entirely with these feathers. I feel like that would be too much and take away from the sculpture. So I think by having carved elements too, it will balance it out nicely. So I just want to make sure if I wrap this back in plastic, I don't wrap it so tightly that I break or bend those little feathers that are sticking up. So you just have to be very careful with your piece. So now I want to come in and work with some of my tools to kind of imprint some texture into the bird as opposed to adding all of my feather details, because you can create some cool feather textures or whatever textures you might be using for your piece by imprinting. And I will often do this on like practice clay first before I apply it to my actual sculpture. So you can see I'm using this little tool. I'm pressing it and kind of twisting it, and I'm making sure my placement isn't perfect because things in nature aren't perfect, and it makes it look a little bit more organic, realistic. If they're not all the exact same shape, size, depth, dimension. So now there's some cool characteristics underneath, and I think I'll carry through with some of that on the back and even the head of the form. And that can be some really interesting places for like glazes to react and break over. Once I'm done adding my texture and I'm happy with how the piece looks, the very last step is to add my spout. So remember, this is a hidden teapot. This is something that is going to pour water out. We have this tubing mechanism inside that we can't forget about. So I need a second hole or a spout where that water can pour back out of the form. So once I get everything on it and I'm happy with how it looks, I decided in my sketch that right underneath the beak, I would create my spout or my hole, and that would be where my water pours out. So I'm just drawing my little line in on my beak to separate the top and bottom beak. So it's one little extra detail I want to add. And then I'm going to take my skewer and I'm going to poke a hole into the beak, or right underneath the beak. I'm going to twist it, clean it up, make sure it goes through the form, and now I have a spout and a finished sculpture that is also a hidden teapot.